Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is overseeing some locomotive repairs. Recently, I completed a series of videos on how to assemble and configure a basic DCC-EX command station to run our trains, as well as a series of videos on getting started with JMRI's DecoderPro app and JMRI Throttles to control our DCC locomotives. If you haven't already seen those videos, be sure to check them out. In this video, we'll change tracks and take a break from talking about command stations and control software and just look at running some trains. As I introduce you to my D-Saver layout and switching puzzle app and show you how to enjoy hours of switching operations on a tiny 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale layout. In later videos, we'll look at some additional hardware projects for DCC-EX, including adding a second LCD and an OLED display to our command station, as well as some ways we can edit the EX command station software and set up automations in EX Rail. Be sure to check this video's description for links to my other videos, as well as the websites and products I mention here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're hauling the peddler today, so find the switch list, grab an iron, and we'll wheel him out of here. Meet the D-Saver, 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale switching layout. Now that we've assembled a DCC-EX command station and learned how to use JMRI to control our trains, let's look at how to conduct some challenging switching operations on a tiny 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale layout using modern rolling stock and DCC sound-equipped locomotives. Here are all the loads and empties we'll be wheeling today. First, we'll look again at the design of the D-Saver layout. Then we'll look at how operations on the D-Saver work and some of the features of the layout. After that, we'll look at the D-Saver switching puzzle app and how I use that to create and keep track of all the switch lists for the operating sessions. Finally, we'll conduct a switching session on the D-Saver to see firsthand how it works, and then run some trains. We're clear on the main, so notch up the throttle on this old hog and let's walk the dog. Meet the D-Saver, 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale switching layout. Part 1. The D-Saver layout. As I described in my first two videos, I designed the D-Saver layout so I could run my HO scale DCC sound-equipped 4-axle GP locomotives and conduct switching operations with modern 50 to 60-foot rolling stock in the small space I had available. In my third video, I walked viewers step by step through how I created the D-Saver and explained my thought process and all the decisions I made on how to design and build the layout. For an HO scale layout, the D-Saver is tiny. While my own D-Saver layout is built on a 1-foot by 6-foot shelf board, the track plan itself is only 8 inches by 54 inches in size. This is actually 6 inches longer than the original 4-foot or 48-inch length I had in mind when I started. There has been a lot of interest lately in very small layouts. Ironically, on the day I sat down to start this video, my October 2024 issue of Model Railroader magazine arrived. Starting on page 51 in this issue, there is a feature by Thomas Klimovsky featuring 2 possible HO scale track plans for the Florida East Coast Railroad's Pompano Market branch line. One of the HO scale track plans is designed for a spare bedroom, but the other is designed for an 18-inch by 6-foot 8-inch hollow core door. The track plan for this smaller layout is nearly identical to the D-Saver, with just a slightly different runaround and using number 6 turnouts versus the number 4 I used on the D-Saver. Perhaps self-conscious about the small size of the layout, the author felt compelled to suggest adding an optional 2-foot staging cassette to the end of the layout to really help with switching operations. Describing the small track plan, the author says, "This layout will allow you to build your skills of track laying, wiring, structure building, and operations. It's a great layout for a beginner or someone with very little space for a layout." Well, I can attest to the last part of that sentence anyway. My 1-foot by 6-foot D-Saver actually impedes my workspace, which I need for my job, and blocks part of my desk. So I end up moving the layout on a daily basis. And a staging cassette would eliminate much of the challenge I designed the D-Saver to provide. Along with my subscription, Model Railroader also recently sent me a 47-page compilation of 14 skill-building model railroad projects. The first project featured is an 8-inch by 6-foot HO scale shelf layout from Lance Mintime. Lance is a well-known and respected model railroader who has written numerous books on various model railroading topics, contributed to several model railroading publications, including Model Railroader, and has a popular YouTube channel as well as his own website. In his piece for Model Railroader, Lance suggests that modelers who don't have space to build a layout can nevertheless hone their skills by working on a small shelf layout which can fit virtually anywhere and can even be stored upright in a closet. That is exactly the situation I was in when I designed the D-Saver. But I had to chuckle when I read the list of skills that Lance suggests we'll need to develop. Forgive me if I sound like a broken record, but they include laying cork roadbed, laying, painting, and ballasting track, wiring, setting up a control system, basic scenery skills, and structure building skills. For those who are counting, that's 2 separate articles that have told me that beginning model railroaders need to develop skills in track laying, structure building, and scenery making. What kind of gatekeeping is that? While those are certainly valuable skills for model railroading, what about developing skills like building your own command station, learning how to install and configure DCC decoders, experimenting with different types of throttles to control your trains, automating train movements, or practicing prototypical switching operations? There's no reason that a so-called beginning model railroader can't choose to start with these skills and move on to other things like ballasting track, structure building, and scenery making later. Learning how to assemble and configure a command station such as DCC-EX, program DCC decoders with software such as JMRI, control trains with different types of throttles such as the Y-throttle and engine driver apps, automate train movements with EX rail, and perform prototypical switching operations are all skills that a model railroader of any experience can practice and develop on a small shelf layout like the D-Saver. Part 2. Operations on the D-Saver. As I have mentioned in prior videos, the D-Saver is a switching puzzle layout. It is my version of John Allen's famous time saver layout, which has been around for over 50 years, with a bit of Inglenook Siding's shunting puzzle mixed in, but sized and arranged to fit my small space, made with commercially available track, and suitable for modern HO scale 50 to 60 foot rolling stock and 4-axle GP switching locomotives. Although the D-Saver is a switching puzzle layout, it is meant to be operated in a somewhat prototypical fashion, using 1 locomotive and 6 freight cars. Unlike the time saver, where the goal is to complete the puzzle as quickly as possible, on the D-Saver there is no timer, and the slower we go and the more time we take, the better. I typically spend about 30 to 40 minutes on each operating session, and could easily spend twice that much if I stopped to line each turnout and manually set the brakes on each car I pick up or set out. And while we might generally aim to complete our switching activities as efficiently as possible, we do not count car moves, how many times we change directions, or anything else for that matter. On the D-Saver, the puzzle we are trying to solve is just to get all 6 cars placed into their correct spots. That might sound simple, but because the D-Saver is so small, it is actually quite challenging. Understanding operations on the D-Saver begins with the location of the layout. The D-Saver is located along a fictional branch line or industrial lead serving a number of different industries. The D-Saver itself serves one of these industries, which spans both sides of the tracks and receives many different types of freight cars. I like to imagine the setting as being on the fringes of an urban area, but it could just as easily be a rural one. And since I like to run locomotives with a number of different road names, we'll also just imagine that a number of different railroads serve the industries along this line. While fictional, this arrangement is inspired by prototypical conditions in my area, where Union Pacific and BNSF share trackage through town, and I frequently see foreign power on the main line and branch leads. The main line down the middle of the D-Saver represents a segment of the larger branch line industrial lead. Short spurs on sidings above and below the main line provide 5 spotting locations to set out and pick up freight cars from the local industry. During each operating session, a locomotive enters from the right with from 1 to 4 freight cars, sets out some of the cars, moves some of the cars at the industry from one spot to another, and picks up some of the cars from the industry before leaving the layout to the left with its train. The upper spur on the right side of the layout has spots for 2 cars. I model this location as being a warehouse, which I printed on the photo backdrop. The spur on the bottom left side of the layout also has spots for 2 cars. I model this as a multi-purpose freight yard, which is located below the spur just off the layout. Finally, the spur at the bottom right side of the layout has a spot for 1 car. This spur can be used as either a team track or a temporary storage location for a car waiting to move to another spot on the layout or leave the layout on a later train. The track on the bottom siding between the 2 spurs is not a spotting location, but rather part of the runaround track. On my as-built layout, I have also included a spur at the upper left side of the layout, but as I described in my video number 3, this is not actually part of the D-Saver, but rather just a storage location for a few cars that I added to the layout for visual interest. Maybe someday it will become part of the D-Saver Plus. For now, however, we are going to ignore it for the rest of this video, and I will not include it on any of the track diagrams. As I mentioned a moment ago, in addition to the 5 industry spotting locations, the locomotive can enter the layout from the right with from 1 to 4 freight cars. These cars are meant to represent the first few cars in a much longer train of cars bound for other industries somewhere down the line. I like to represent this imaginary train of cars with a boxcar fitted with a flashing rear-end device, which I park on an extra piece of track just off the right side of the layout proper. So if you see a yellow rail box at the end of the train in my layout videos, that is just selective compression at work. One notable consequence of this is that for the purposes of our operating sessions on the D-Saver, the locomotive cannot back its train off the layout. Not because there is no add-on cassette of track for it to do so, but because it would not be practical for the conductor to walk all the way to the back of the train in this instance, or possibly because the train would foul a crossing if it were to do so. So the limitations of the space we have available to model in become a prototypical feature of our layout and add to the challenge of our operating sessions. At the other end of the main line, just off the left side of the layout, there is a grade crossing with some construction going on. To minimize interfering with the maintenance of way crew and unnecessarily blocking traffic, the locomotive cannot leave the layout to the left and proceed through the grade crossing until it has reassembled its entire train and is ready to move on down the line to its next set of deliveries. Therefore, all the switching on the D-Saver has to be done within the confines of the layout. Between the 5 industry car spotting locations, the 4 possible inbound car locations, and a location for the locomotive, there are 10 possible car and locomotive destinations accounted for on the layout. In addition, for switching purposes, there is 1 additional car spot on the upper spur, 1 additional car spot on the left side of the main line, and 3 car spots in the middle of the lower siding. Again, this arrangement has some notable consequences for how we conduct our switching operations. For example, because there are only 2 car spots to the left of the turnout for the upper siding, the locomotive can only move 1 car at a time on or off of the upper spur. And the locomotive cannot move any cars on or off of the lower siding from the left side of the main line, although it can shove 1 car from the runaround track up onto the main line. A car in the lower right-hand spur will severely limit the locomotive's ability to use the runaround track. Also, if there are more than 2 cars on the main line, they will block at least one of the turnouts, if not more. The list goes on. A locomotive with more than 2 cars on the main line will not be able to back a car onto the lower right-hand spur. A locomotive on the bottom siding pulling cars off the lower left-hand spur can pull both cars at once by itself, but can only pull 1 car at a time if it is using another car as a handle. Another important thing to note, a turnout cannot be thrown while there is a car on the track the turnout is a part of, even if the car is not technically fouling the points. The car needs to be moved to a clear track before the turnout can be thrown. It is important to realize that these limits are an intentional feature of the D-Saver, designed to make the switching operations a challenge. We could easily add a few inches of track here or there to get around many of these limitations, but that would defeat the purpose of the D-Saver layout, which is to provide a stimulating puzzle to solve while offering the opportunity to conduct lots of prototypically low-speed switching operations, making good use of the runaround track while manually controlling our turnouts and coupling and uncoupling cars. Although there are a total of 15 possible car spots on the layout and 9 car spotting destinations, I had always intended for the D-Saver to be a 6-car switching puzzle. In other words, each switching session always involves 1 locomotive and 6 freight cars. I am pretty sure the D-Saver could be operated with 7 cars, and it can certainly be operated with fewer than 6 cars, but I find that 6 seems to be just the right number for the amount of time and effort required to complete an operating session. What this means is that if there are 4 freight cars set out at industry spots at the beginning of an operating session, the inbound locomotive will bring 2 more cars onto the layout. Conversely, if there are only 2 cars set out at the start, the locomotive will bring in 4 cars. The same arrangement is true for when a locomotive leaves the layout. The number of cars set out at industry plus the number behind the locomotive always adds up to 6. Because there are only 5 industry car spots on the layout, the locomotive will always have at least 1 freight car in its train. And because the D-Saver main line only has 6 car locomotive spots total, and there needs to be at least 1 empty spot for the locomotive to be able to move into to clear a switch, the maximum number of freight cars the locomotive can enter or leave the layout with is 4. Therefore, there will always be at least 2 cars spotted on the layout at the beginning or end of each session. This covers all the parameters, I hesitate to call them rules, of the D-Saver. To begin our first switching session, each of the 6 cars is randomly assigned to one of the 9 possible car destinations, which include the 5 at the industry and the 4 in the train. We then place one of our locomotives in the 10th spot and back it up as needed to make a train with the cars that were randomly placed behind it. We then repeat this process to determine where each car needs to be at the end of the switching session. With all our starting and ending locations set, we begin our switching operations. We may find that some of the cars set out at industry need to be moved to other spots at the industry, perhaps to facilitate their loading or unloading, or to make way for another car. Sometimes a car will move from the industry to the temporary storage team track, or vice versa. Sometimes cars in the train behind the locomotive will need to be placed in a different order to facilitate their delivery to another location further down the branch line. And sometimes we may need to relocate a car that was improperly spotted by the previous crew. In any case, once we have completed all our switching, we reassemble our train and proceed off the layout. We can model this on the D-Saver by pulling our train all the way to the left end of the layout and blowing the grade crossing signal on the horn. Our first operating session is now complete. We can remove the locomotive and its train from the layout and start the next session. We can either start over from the beginning and remove all the cars from the industry spotting locations and randomly assign them again, or else use the ending state from the previous switching session as a starting point for the next one, which is what I prefer. For variety, we can replace the locomotive and cars that went off the layout at the end of the last session with a new locomotive and cars, which we place on the inbound track on the right side of the main line. We then repeat the process of randomly determining where each car needs to be at the end of the round of switching. With that, we're ready to start the next switching operating session. And so the process continues, with one session feeding into the next. While it may sound simple, each session is unique and offers its own set of challenges. I have now completed over 100 such sessions and continue to enjoy them as much as when I started a year and a half ago. As I said before, I typically spend about 30 to 40 minutes on each operating session and could easily spend more. We have now looked at the D-Saver layout and examined how the switching sessions work. But there is one more part of the D-Saver we need to explore, and that is the D-Saver Switching Puzzle app that I use to create and keep track of the switch lists for all the operating sessions conducted on the D-Saver. We'll do that next. Part 3. The D-Saver Switching Puzzle app. As I mentioned before, the D-Saver was inspired in large part by John Allen's Time Saver. While I have seen copies of the Time Saver in use, I have never had the opportunity to actually operate one myself. However, I have tried the app version of the Time Saver, available for the iPhone and iPad. One of the features of the app version of the Time Saver is that each of the freight cars is a different color, and the color of the car matches the color of the industry destination for that car. So for example, the blue freight car needs to be spotted at the blue industry, and the green car at the green industry, and so on. While searching on YouTube for examples of the Time Saver and other small switching layouts, I came across a video from Steve of DriverDTrains. In the video, Steve explained how he built an HO scale switching layout for his garage based on the Inglenook Sidings shunting puzzle. But what really struck me about Steve's layout was the way he designed car cards featuring pictures of each freight car that he could then place on the layout to indicate where each car needed to go. I realized immediately that I wanted to do the same thing for the D-Saver, except that instead of printing and laminating pictures of my freight cars on paper, I wanted to display them on my computer. Taking ideas from both the iOS Time Saver app and Steve's laminated car cards, I set about creating the D-Saver Switching Puzzle app. I actually started creating the D-Saver app before I had even assembled the layout. At first, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted the app to do. I thought that I might want the app to be playable, like the iOS Time Saver app. My earliest version only used different colors to represent different cars. But after I saw Steve's video, I decided to incorporate pictures of my freight cars into the app and redesigned it accordingly. However, I kept the color concept from the iOS app as well, and made each of the 6 freight cars a different color to make it visually easier to see where each one needed to go. I also wasn't sure at first what the goal of the D-Saver switching puzzle would be. Would it involve switching all 6 cars on the layout to their proper spots, or just a few? But once I realized that I could, in fact, switch all 6 cars to any spot on the layout as part of the puzzle, it became clear that what I needed was an app to generate the random starting and ending positions for each car. I decided to create this app in Microsoft Excel because I use it all the time for work, and I was confident that I could get it to do what I wanted fairly quickly. Ultimately, I plan to port the D-Saver to being a web app. But for now, Excel it is. After doodling with some formulas, importing a copy of the D-Saver's track plan, adding pictures of my rolling stock, and setting up a random number generator, I soon had a list of switching sessions indicating the starting and ending positions for each car. 2 color-coded track diagrams showed the starting and ending positions for each of the 6 cars based on their color. With this information, I could begin running some trains. At first, I only programmed 1 locomotive and 1 car of each color into the app, so all the switching sessions use the same locomotive and same 6 cars. However, I knew that eventually I would want to change this. I quickly made some updates to the organization of the app. I started setting up a page where I could eventually add more cars and locomotives to my roster, and set up another page to keep track of all the switching sessions. I started experimenting with different ways to display the car locations graphically on the screen. Within a week, I had a well-organized app with a page for my rolling stock, a page for the random number generator for the puzzles, a page listing all the switching sessions by date, and a page for the track plan showing the starting and ending locations of each car for any of the stored switching sessions, which could be selected from a drop-down menu. I even added a background image to the main page. To add some variety to my operating sessions, I would often use a different locomotive or freight cars than what were shown on the app. But after 2 months, I decided it was time to actually add some more locomotives to the app so that it could decide which one I should run on each session. Then I reconfigured the app to add more rolling stock to the roster and reprogrammed it to randomly select which cars to use for each operating session. However, I kept it so that each switching session still features 1 car of each color: red, yellow, green, blue, brown, and black or white. Finally, to make things more prototypical, I adjusted the car selection algorithm to only replace the cars that went off the layout with the locomotive in the previous session, while leaving the cars located at the industry spurs in their car spots. And this is what the D-Saver looks like today. It has a selection of locomotives and rolling stock to choose from. The consist generator analyzes the previous session's outbound freight to randomly generate a new inbound train, then randomly determines all the switching moves to generate a new outbound train. Each new switching session is then copied to the historical list of operating sessions, which can be selected on the main page of the puzzle app from the drop-down menu. The track plans then update to show the current locomotive and the starting and ending positions of each car, while the train shown at the top updates to show all the cars and the locomotive on the layout. And with that information in hand, we are ready to start switching our train and setting out cars. Part 4. A switching session on the D-Saver. Now that we've looked at the D-Saver layout, learned about its operation, and seen how the D-Saver app works, let's start switching some cars. For today's freight, we're running Union Pacific 643, a GP 38-2 that UP inherited when it purchased the Missouri Pacific in 1982. But we've got no time for history lessons, so grab that switch list and let's get started. We've already pulled our locomotive in from the right-hand side of the layout, and now we're looking at red signals both ahead and behind. I'm just glad we cleared that crossing back there and didn't have to brake the train. That would have added the better part of an hour to our troubles today. We're inbound with 2 covered hoppers, but according to the switch list, we're only setting out the second one, a blue ADM 4-bay grain car. I have no idea why it's here. Maybe someone is setting up a microbrewery. But we're supposed to deliver it to warehouse door number 1. It looks like we'll be taking the orange Denver and Rio Grande 3-bay with us to the next stop. At least, I think it's orange under all that dust. Before we can do that, however, we need to relocate that rusty, beat-up old boxcar to the staging spot on the team track. According to this paperwork, there should be Frisco lettering under all that grime. I'm also seeing that we need to collect the yellow Throttles boxcar from the other warehouse door. Hey, you ever see one of those Throttles without its doors? It ain't pretty. We also need to collect the green Burlington Northern covered hopper from one of the spots in the freight yard. And we're going to need to sort those outbound cars into the proper order too, if we're going to make the rest of our deliveries down the line and get home before Christmas. While this all sounds straightforward, the actual sequence of moves we will need to make is quite different and not straightforward at all. We better get started. First, we need to swap the order of the 2 hoppers on the inbound train. Then we can pull both cars at the warehouse off the upper spur and spot them in front of our train. Just remember, Greenhorn, we can only pull them 1 car at a time. Now, let's place the blue ADM, the yellow Throttles, and the orange DRG on the upper spur. Slow down, Hotfoot. Remember, we can only move one car at a time onto that spur. Okay, let's slide down onto the lower siding. We can finally pull that green BN out of the spur at the freight yard and shove it up onto the main line. Now we get to play Ring Around the Rosie with that BN. Check your pocket for posies and make sure you don't fall down. We need to circle the runaround, couple onto the green BN, and pull the car past the turnout to the lower siding so we can run around to the other side. Then we'll use the BN as a handle to grab the Frisco boxcar and back that economy sleeper into its spot on the lower spur for the storage team track. Now we can pull the orange DRG hopper and the yellow Thrall boxcar off the upper siding. Make sure we spot that blue ADM at the correct warehouse door, or we'll never hear the end of it from the industry man. It looks like all our packages are finally in order. Let's tie them on, buckle the rubbers, and puff up the pipe. Now the only thing left to do is wait to get our clearance from the dip scratcher. Good job, Roughneck. We've made all our drops and the muckers have cleared the track. We've got the green eye, so sound the horn and let's roll on out. In a few days, a new train will arrive with an entirely new switch list, but that will be some other grunt's problem. Part 5. Let's run some trains. Well, we've now all experienced the D-Saver firsthand. That was quite an eye-opener. I think we might need to sleep on that for a bit to let it all sink in. Or maybe we're ready to go right back out on the next run. We better watch our hours, though. We don't want to become outlawed and have to tie up here. But there's still a bit of daylight and plenty more to do, so let's go run some trains. Finally, long-term viewers may remember that in my first video, I mentioned that from time to time, I would highlight some of the model railroaders here on YouTube that inspired me to design the D-Saver and start this YouTube channel. So before I go, I have two more model railroad YouTubers that I'd like to highlight now.
Hey, it's Steve. Are you looking to add some operations to your layout?
First, I'd like to thank Steve from Steve's Trains for inspiring me to design the D-Saver switching puzzle app.
Hey, it's Steve. In this video, we're going to take a look at a new layout project that I'll be working on here in 2023.
Steve is constantly building new small layouts and is usually working on more than one at a time.
But here is the 2x4 foot N scale layout that I plan to work on during the course of 2023 along with some other projects.
Steve's focus is on small model railroads, usually in N scale, but he sometimes works in other scales too. And while most of his layouts are ovals, he does occasionally build switching layouts, and it was one of these, the HO scale 1 foot by 6 foot Tulsa spur, that first caught my attention. But what really inspired me was his use of simple printed car cards that just included photos of his freight cars on them, positioned right on the layout so that he knew exactly where every car needed to go without having to create a printed switch list. This clear, visual representation of the freight cars right on the layout suddenly makes a complex switching problem much easier to handle, and it was this system that directly inspired me to design the D-Saver switching puzzle app, which also works by displaying pictures of the freight cars superimposed right on the track plan. You can find a link to Steve's train in the description, as well as on my channel's page. Next, I'd like to mention Poor Frank. Poor Frank works on a Canadian national grain line somewhere in the interior of British Columbia. Frank and some of his colleagues, including Bill, Carl, Fred, and Dave, live on a small 2 foot by 8 foot switching layout built on a Fremo module. Although its dimensions are a bit larger, with longer turnouts and sidings, the geometry of the track plan is nearly identical to that of the D-Saver, with only one side of the runaround being different. Frank's modeler, Dustin, built the module to practice his modeling skills and also to provide a vehicle to share his model railroading comedy.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Both Dustin and Frank have gotten up to some hijinks on his YouTube channel. A few years ago, Dustin had to move and took a break from posting videos. During the past year, however, he has started posting a new series of videos on building a model railroad diorama display module, still with his self-depreciating sense of humor. Check out Poor Frank to see what Dustin is up to, and make sure to watch some of his older videos to see what kind of mischief Frank and his crew are getting into. I think I even saw Bigfoot. Again, you can find a link in the description and on my channel's page. What's next? Switching operations on a 1 foot by 6 foot HO scale layout. In my next video, we'll try an operating session on the D-Saver in real time. After that, we'll look at how to set up some more automations in DCC-EX EX Rail. We'll also look at some other ways to modify the DCC-EX EX command station software. Then we'll learn how to add a second LCD and an OLED display to our DCC-EX command station. The freight keeps moving, but we've done our bit for today. Find yourself a bunk and grab some hay while you can, because we'll be back at it in no time. Until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, have all the locomotive repairs been completed? All right then, let's go run some trains. All aboard!